how does it, because, part of this project is to do a multi-layered mapping, but you have a place like El Pueblo, right? That's this mass place where they used to sell Tomba people. They, and girls and young children fetched a better price, and I think that's nefarious in nature and leads to sexual violence, um, sort of particularly with Tomba women or California Indian women, um, where Deborah Miranda talks about the fact that people are upset now about the 1 in 3 statistics, but back in those days there was a 100% chance you were going to be raped as a Tomba woman, which is just really startling when you think about it. And it is, it was much more likely than not. But the fact that they've named that a El Pueblo Cultural Center, like, how did that feel to you? It's like a covering of geographies in a way, or of important primary geographies.
Excuse me.
I mean, how do you make peace with those sorts of things?
I don't think we have yet.
Yeah.
It's still ongoing because I think the issues, excuse me, that we have with that whole cultural center is they haven't acknowledged the history of the people that have come from that area. I think, again, the indigenous people and even the first settlers of that area, which are my
I
families.
think there can be any reconciliation unless you even acknowledge the history of the selling of people post slavery.
You can. There was so much that that happened there, and the Pueblo is like ground center for labor exploitation. It's always been that way.
with the lack of acknowledgement of California Indians,
Right.
or the lack of acknowledgement of that brutal history, or the really just not wanting to acknowledge it.
And Cindy and I have talked about this too, and I think the not wanting to acknowledge it in a contemporary sense is because you have to look at the families who have profited from that and their status today, and if they acknowledge that, what does it say about them and their material wealth, or what they've acquired, and how did they acquire that?
Yeah.
It's been at the expense of who and what, so there's a lot of that. There was a lot of that. I mean, there were stories that I've read about young women having acquiring syphilis and working for a particular ranch, and the ranch owner would just leave them on the roadside because they didn't want to pay for their medical care, so they would just leave them out there. And but you had all these things going on, and again, it goes back to a lot of these these California mandates and policies with the mandated selling of the children,
The
and
1850 Vagrancy Act.
yeah, all these different acts, all these different things that were enacted, and they really perpetuated that. And in the Los Angeles basin, at the time I could never understand it, but when I would ask my mother, how come your grandmother, she never acknowledged who she was and she didn't want to talk about it?
Yeah.
It makes sense. Because she was born into that. She was born, I think, in 1852, and yet she had tattoos on her face, but she would never talk about them. There were stories in my family of cause my mother was too young, but some of my older aunts would ask her where she got the tattoos, and she would just say she was born like that. She never wanted to talk about anything like that, But and as a young person hearing those stories, I could never understand it, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then I went, as I started doing more research and going back in history and finding out what was going on, it's no wonder, because that was part of our survival, was to deny that and to not pass that on to the next generation. Because to remember it or to pass it on was to kind of bring that with you too, and it was so painful that you didn't want to.
And I do think people have to understand, as part of the trauma or the telling of these histories of places and these relationships, geographic or social, that it's all about, a lot of times, no matter what happened, people want to protect the next generation.
Right.
And that's an important thing. But I appreciate you telling the stories, because it's not easy, but the telling is so important. The telling.
Yeah. It is
That's
for
survival.
me. It's been part of my own personal healing too, because I remember as a young person when in my early 20s when I started learning a lot about this, I became so angry, and I carried a lot of anger, and I looked at Cindy and others in Mother Earth Clan as a way to alleviate that or to channel that. So that's how I started doing education,
Oh.
was to do what they were doing, because I did have a lot of that anger inside me, and again, at my age, doing this cultural education for so many years, um, I saw that coming back, because in the last maybe 15 years, I focused on plants, and as I talked with you, trying to go out there and harvest them, I've realized how much we don't have, how much we don't have our access. So that started creating another level of anger, but then it was okay, Craig, you're older now. How do you channel that anger? How do you channel
It's
that?
my daily question.
Yeah, it's like, how do you channel that and not become angry and bitter about anybody who calls himself an immigrant and this and that? And so there are ways to do it, but that talking about it is part of my own personal healing.
Yeah.
I don't, as painful as it can be, because I'm still going through things personally, that are, that I'm struggling through, but talking about it has been part of that healing. And I think part of the fact that, I look at my family, and I'm the youngest of 7 siblings, and I'm the only one who really carries on a lot of this. But then I look at my larger family, my cousins and everything, and a lot of them don't know. And I'm wondering if that's part of their protection. Is that the fact that they don't know? Because as much as our families suffer with addiction and all these other things, I think about what would that extra layer be if they really knew and they didn't know how to channel that. Sometimes, I think that, especially for me personally, being on the land of my ancestors provides a lot of healing too.
Yeah.
There are certain places I go to. Not that they're necessarily any secret magical healing places. They're the only places we have left that are natural, that haven't been developed. So those are the places, like in the mountains, the Santa Ana Mountains close to where I live. If I'm, feeling stressed out or something, that's where I go to kind of revitalize myself. Just being out there for the day. It's those type of things, that reconnecting, just reconnecting, even though it's touching the earth wherever you are. As simple as that.
I go out and plant, even though
Yeah.
it's not, like, I miss my home, but
Yeah.
that's,
Yeah.
that becomes important. But I think about it, a lot of people are very concerned with ending global, I just wrote this to my friend yesterday, like, wanting to end global oppression is a very noble and a very big thing. But unless we can have a planet for anybody to act on, it doesn't matter how many laws we change or how many any of this changes, because I just see the real destruction of land, environment, aquifers in the middle of the country. I think Indigenous issues are at the forefront. They're going to be the ones that protect everybody, not just Indigenous knowledge.
Right. Yeah.
And like even what you're saying about the drought, right? If using Indigenous knowledges to deal with the drought becomes so important. I don't know. That's how I see it. I see it at the forefront. I think about Ine Begay and Evan Peterson up in Alaska, or even some of my Native Alaskan ex-students up there that I'm really proud of, working on climate change, because they're the ones that are seeing it. Their elders are the ones that are seeing it and able to assess what's going on, like the changes in the landscape, or those are the knowledges that are going to save the world.
Yeah, it is, and I think it is. But again, one of the things that I stress in my educating, even when the kids here, is just knowing where your source of sustenance comes from. Because these kids are so disconnected from where their food comes from, or anything they need to survive. I tell them, you're standing on what provides your sustenance right now. That's what's important, and you guys need to protect that. Because I think a lot of people, they become so disconnected from the nature.
Yeah.
so disconnected from it, and they don't realize that, you know, one day this could all disappear, and then what are you going to do to survive? And if you don't know how to make that connection, you're
Yeah.
lost.
I think people rely on technology. They think that technology is going to save things
Yeah.
somehow.